In the last video, we explored the two back-end securable types, API and APIX, used to restrict what types of data and which individual records users are able to request from the server and the ways in which that data can then be manipulated. In this video, we're going to look at the two front-end securable types, URL and DOM. As I mentioned in the introductory video for this series, URL securables are used to restrict access to particular pages in Plat, while DOM securables provide a more granular level of control, enabling individual elements of particular pages, such as tabs, menu items, and individual fields, to be hidden or disabled. The first and most important distinction between back-end and front-end securables is that while users are by default prevented from making any server requests, they are granted access to all pages and all of the content of those pages by default. Therefore, while it is necessary to grant API and APIX permissions before users will be able to access any data at all, we only need to use URL or DOM securables if we wish to restrict our users' access to certain pages or to individual elements of those pages. With this in mind, let's take a quick look at the default setup that will be inherited by your organization when the RBAC module is deployed. For the top-level admin group, there are no DOM or URL items in the securables list at all, meaning that members of this group will have unrestricted front-end access. For the basic group, there are some restrictions. If I filter this list to look just at the URL restrictions, you'll see that the only restriction that will be applied to basic users is access to the users page. That is the page used to create, view, and update system users. And as for DOM securables, well, we see that the main setup menu is hidden. That's the menu up here. And there are three individual menu items which appear in context menus on other pages that are also hidden. Defining new URL securables is easy. Let's run through a couple of examples. I'll start by navigating to the securables list through this menu item and clicking on New at the top of the page. In this first example, I'm going to restrict access to the page that is used to create, view, and modify event types. To do this, I'll give my new record an appropriate description, select the type as URL and the data type as event type. And that's it. After I've saved my new record, the usage summary is shown, and I can use this button to add it to the satellite admin user group, which is currently the only user group I have permission to update. As I am currently a member of this user group, this should apply immediately to myself. Let's give it a try. I will be able to access the event type list, but I won't now be able to access the individual event types. To restrict access to pages that aren't one of Plat's standard data entry pages, you will need to know the appropriate URL. Let's say for argument's sake that I don't want members of the satellite admin group to have access to the training matrix. Let's go to that page first of all and copy its URL to the clipboard. And then we'll create a new securable as before. Give this one a description as appropriate. And again, select the appropriate type. This time I'm not going to be selecting a data type though. Instead, I will be using the URL field and pasting in the value that I copied to my clipboard previously. I need to start by cleaning this up. The part at the beginning before the / here is the site name. This will be different for you, and that needs to be removed. And now I have a decision to make. You'll notice that this URL includes a question mark followed by the word org ID and here a record ID. You can probably guess that this part of the URL tells Plat which organization will be shown in the training matrix. If I wanted to prevent Satellite Office group members from accessing the training matrix for demo care only, I would leave that part of the URL in. If I wanted to restrict access to the training matrix for any organization, I would remove it, like this. After adding this securable to my user group, I can paste in the URL that we've just been setting up a restriction on and see on the effect of that. And there we see that I am denied permission to that URL and returned immediately to the home page with a suitable message. In the previous video in this series, we set up two different API securables that could be used to prevent users from updating or deleting one particular record of a certain type. We can use the same techniques with URL securables to prevent users from accessing particular records at the front end. Let's say, for argument's sake, that I wanted to prevent members of the satellite admin group from accessing the demo care organization entirely. I'll use the parameterized approach demonstrated in the earlier video by first creating a new securable, selecting the appropriate type and data type, and then choosing parameter for this applies to field. After saving, we'll add this securable to the satellite admin group, and because it is parameterized, I'm required to choose which record this assignment should apply to. I will choose demo care, and then click OK. To test this, I'll go to the organization list and attempt to click on demo care. Notice how I'm prevented from doing this, but I can still access other organizations. The applies to field that we have just used for our parameterized organization page securable has a couple of other uses. If we return to the definition of the basic user group inherited from top level that we were looking at earlier, we are reminded that members of this group are prevented from accessing the user page. It is very likely that you will want to prevent basic users from accessing other users' records, but you may need them to be able to access their own record, if only so they have access to their own calendar for scheduling assessments and the like. To grant users access to their own user page while preventing them from accessing this page for other users, we'll need to set up another new securable. But before we do this, as we cannot update this basic user group, we're going to need to clone it first. I'll select user group, clone user group, and then select the appropriate organization. I'm going to give this new record the same description as the one that we have just cloned. Although you shouldn't have two user groups with the same name set up against the same organization, it's fine to duplicate the description given to user groups at a higher level. Now we have our own basic user group set up, let's go ahead and define a securable that will enable users to access their own page. Let's give our new securable a suitable description, select URL as the type and person as the data type. Now let's take a look at the options provided for the applies to field. Previously you may remember that this pick list contained just one option, parameter, but when the person data type is selected above, two additional options are provided. Self, of course, means that this securable would apply specifically to each user's own record, while contact would mean it applying to anyone who is a contact of the current user. I'll select self, save, and then complete this now familiar step to add this to the securables list of one or more user groups. Notice that there are now two user groups that I can add this securable to, although I'll only select basic on this occasion. Before I click OK, I shall choose the invert logic option, because here I am granting access to a particular URL rather than preventing it. To test this new rule, I will navigate to my own user record and switch my user group to the basic group that we have just set up. Notice how there are now two user groups called basic, but these are disambiguated by the name of the relevant organization. After saving, I do not receive any error, despite being on a page that I should generally not be allowed to have access to. Of course, I am being allowed to remain here because I am currently viewing my own user record, which our new self-securable allows me to do. To prove that things really are working as expected, I'll go to the user list and attempt to open some of the other user records. And then that again of myself. Now that I have front-end access to my own user record, we have a potential security concern. If I am able to access this record, I have access to the Security tab, and from here can set up overrides to my own security profile, potentially granting myself permission to areas of the system that I should not have access to. One possible solution to this would be to set up an API securable preventing me from updating my own record. A good solution, but what if users are trusted to maintain their own training records and therefore require the ability to save changes made from this training tab? In this case, I cannot be prevented from saving changes to my own user record. So what are our other options? Probably the best, and perhaps the only option, is to use DOM securables to hide or disable the security tab entirely, thus preventing me from making changes here, while still allowing the record to be updated in other ways. We'll start by hiding the security tab entirely. To do this, I will need to set up a new securable. That's quite tricky at the moment though, because I don't currently have access to the setup menu. This is because the setup menu is hidden to members of the basic user group. I can override this for just my user record by selecting the same securable here that has been chosen for my user group and then inverting that. Notice how the setup menu appears. Before we proceed with creating the new securable for this security tab, let's take a quick look at how the setup menu securable is set up. I will click on the adjacent question mark to open the corresponding record. As we would expect, we're dealing here with the DOM type securable. No data type has been selected because this securable does not relate to one of Platt's standard data entry pages. As with URL securables, if no data type has been selected, a URL must be provided. In this case, the URL is just a single /. This is a special case that applies only to the top level New, Plan, and Setup menus. The other important selections on this page are entries in this DOM elements list. DOM elements are individual components that make up a page in Platt, like tabs, fields, and buttons. Every element has an ID, and to hide or disable something, we must first know what that ID is. Here we can see that the setup menu must have an ID of setup menu, capital M, no spaces. But I'm sure you will be wondering how we could have possibly known this ourselves. Well, though it is certainly not something we would have expected you to have known or to have been able to predict, there is an easy way to find it out. Choose Setup and then Identify Page Elements. When the Identify Page Elements option is selected, this message is always displayed to remind us of the meaning of all these coloured borders that we can now see around many of the elements on this page. Here we are told that elements that can be hidden have an orange border, elements that can be disabled have a blue border, and groups of items that can be disabled together have a green border. And as this message concludes by telling us, we can discover the ID of any element that has either an orange, blue, or green border by hovering the mouse over it. Let's close this message and then hover the mouse over the setup menu. And this is how we can discover the ID of that DOM element. When I return to my user record, we'll continue to see the orange, blue, and green coloured borders around elements of this page because page element identification continues until I choose to turn it off. Let's take this opportunity to discover the ID of the element that we're going to be hiding in just a moment. That's simple enough then. Security tab, capital T, no spaces. That shouldn't be hard to remember. Let's disable page element identification now by selecting this option, and then begin setting up a new DOM type securable for hiding the security tab. We'll select the DOM type here, choose person as our data type, and then we'll enter the view as user. We don't need a URL when a data type has been provided. Under DOM elements, we'll add a single item and type in the element ID that we discovered earlier. Hidden is the default selection, which is exactly what we wanted. So let's save this and add it to the securables list for our basic user group. To test the effect of this new securable, I'll open my own user record and note that there is no longer a security tab provided. If I wanted to disable the security tab rather than hiding it, I can return to the relevant securable and choose the disabled effect here. I should remember to change the description too, to avoid confusion later. After making changes to the definition of an existing securable, it is sometimes necessary to log out and back in to see the effect this will have on our own user record. After doing that, notice how this security tab has returned, but I am unable to click on it. Preventing access to a tab in this way doesn't seem like an especially useful ability to have. What might be useful though is to disable some of the tab's content so users are able to see details of their security profile without having the ability to modify it. Doing this is going to require us to discover the ID of a number of additional page elements, which we'll only be able to do by accessing the tab in question. I'll return the security tab to its default state for now by returning to the relevant securable, and then clicking on this cross beside the name of the basic user group in its usage summary. This will remove this record from the securables list of the corresponding user group. After me refreshing my record again, the security tab is enabled once more. So we can now open this tab and begin identifying some of the individual DOM elements found here. Let's activate element identification once more, before considering which of the elements on our security tab need to be disabled. The most obvious is the user groups field. If I'm able to change the value of this field, I could add myself to the admin group, something that I'm sure my boss would like me to be prevented from doing. These next few fields seem fairly innocuous, but my securables list certainly needs to be disabled. As you can see by the various coloured borders that appear around parts of this list, there are several elements that could be disabled or hidden. But whenever you wish to disable an entire list, I would suggest that you hover the mouse over its Add button. The element ID that is shown will be that of the list itself, and this is what we really want to disable in this case. Notice how the Add button has a green border around it. You might remember that each time I activate element identification, the message displayed tells me that green borders identify groups of elements that can be disabled together. For this to work, however, the message goes on to tell us that we must use a special disabled plus children DOM effect, which we'll see in just a moment. It looks like these are the only two elements that we really need to disable, so let's make a mental note of just two IDs, fsysuserdata user groups and fsysuserdata restrictables. We're onto the home stretch now. I'll turn off identification and go back to the securable that I set up for the security tab earlier. I'm going to change its name one final time, and I'm going to remove the element that I added to the list for the security tab. I'll add two items in its place. fsysuserdata user groups that we wish to disable, and fsysuserdata restrictables for which the disabled plus children selection is needed. I'll save this before adding it back to the securables list of the basic user group. Finally, I'll return to my user record to see the effect of all those changes here. Notice that on the security tab, my user groups is now a disabled field. The securables list is also disabled. I cannot modify the existing items, I cannot remove them, and I cannot add new items to this list. I'm going to wrap up this introduction to front-end securables by taking you back to the organization list and opening one of the items there so I can quickly summarize what can and what cannot be achieved using DOM securables. I'm going to activate identification once more so we can see exactly where the colored borders appear. Let's consider first these orange borders that span the full page width. Notice how each of these borders surrounds a field, both the field label and the corresponding input control. They identify fields that can be hidden, and as you'll see, their element ID always begins with CG followed by an underscore. Looking inside these orange field borders, we'll usually find just one blue border around an input control. We can disable the input, in this case, thus allowing the user to see its value without being able to modify it. As you will see, these element IDs will always begin with an F followed by an underscore. And in many cases, that's really all we need to worry about. Do we want to hide a field entirely using the CG prefixed element with the orange border, or disable the corresponding input control by using the F prefixed element with the blue border? The exception to this general case occurs when a field has more than one input control. Let's take a look at an example of this on the Employment tab. Here you will notice that the default training planning window field includes a numeric input as well as a pick list for selecting units. both of these inputs have a blue border around them, identifying that they can each be individually disabled. However, there is also a green border around the two controls together, and this is probably of more use to us as this identifies a group of elements that can be collectively disabled by using the disabled plus children effect. It's important to remember that a page element can only be hidden if it has an orange border or disabled if it has a green or blue border. So this search bar at the top of the page cannot be disabled or hidden, while all of these menus and all of these tabs have both a blue and an orange border, identifying that they can have both effects applied to them. A quick appendum to the videos that we have recently published on Platt's new RBAC module. After those videos were recorded, we realized there was an opportunity to improve the user experience for any customers who have taken the decision to define their own user groups in order to customize the default security profile from that provided by the top level organization user groups. So in the first video of that series, I demonstrated how you could clone the top level basic user group and then of course customize the securables list for that in order to change the behavior. And of course, after you've done that and you have perhaps done your own testing and you've decided that you're happy to use the new user group with your live users, you're going to have to transfer those users or switch those users across to the new user group. The process for doing that could have been to go to each of your individual users in turn, visit the security tab and make the change manually to their user groups list. If you had just a couple of users, that wouldn't be too painful, but if you have a number of users, that would take some time, and there would of course be the possibility of forgetting to transfer some of the users. So what we've done is added a simple wizard for transferring or switching users between user groups. To access that, you go to any user group and select from the context menu this new Switch Users Between Groups option. A quick form to fill in. What we're saying is that we want to switch any user who is from the specified organization, and if you tick this box, also users from any child organizations of this one, and we want to switch them from the chosen user group to this user group. Now the to option is filled in by default to the one that we've just come from, but that doesn't of course have to remain that. You can choose whatever you like. So I'm saying I would like to transfer all of the users from basic top level to basic demo care. So this is the one that I cloned from this one in the video, in the RBAC video series. So I simply click OK. It goes away and it finds all of the users who satisfy the criteria set up from that form, and it lists them alphabetically. If they are from different organizations, which is possible if you have a number of different child organizations, the organization is listed here for clarity so that you can really make sure that you are doing what you had intended to do. I can cancel at this point, nothing will be updated, or I can click OK, and I'll receive this message to let me know that the users have been successfully updated.